I was a cashier framed for missing money until security footage proved the owner did it, but by then Marcus Holloway had already destroyed my life, and I decided it was time to return the favor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as I stood in his cramped office, watching him count the register receipts with theatrical precision. His thick fingers moved across the papers with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. The smell of stale coffee and cheap cologne hung in the air between us, making my stomach turn as much as what I knew was coming. Marcus had called me in 30 minutes after my shift ended, claiming there was a discrepancy in my drawer. The way he said it, discrepancy, like he was savoring each syllable, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about missing money. This was about getting rid of me. He'd been looking for an excuse ever since I'd started asking questions about the employee health insurance premiums that kept disappearing from our paychecks. Ever since I'd noticed that the security cameras had convenient blind spots during his late-night visits. Ever since I'd become a problem he needed to solve. His wedding ring caught the harsh light as he tapped a pen against the desk. The same ring he'd slipped off his finger during those after-hours meetings with Jenny from the deli counter. The same ring that had left a pale band on his finger that his wife probably never noticed, too busy managing their 3 kids and the mortgage on their suburban fortress. The math didn't add up, he announced with mock gravity. $247 short. Exactly the amount I'd need to make rent this month, a detail that wasn't lost on me. He'd been watching, calculating, preparing this moment like a chess master positioning for checkmate. I watched his performance with detached fascination, the way he furrowed his brow in disappointed concern, the careful pause before delivering the verdict, the rehearsed headshake that suggested this decision hurt him more than it hurt me. Marcus Holloway, community pillar, family man, benevolent employer forced to make a difficult choice. My hands remained steady at my sides as he explained the store's zero-tolerance policy, the same policy that hadn't applied when his nephew Derek was caught drinking in the stockroom, the same policy that had mysteriously vanished when his golf buddy's son needed a second chance after the cigarette incident. But for me, the college dropout working 2 jobs to keep my sick mother's medications current, the policy was ironclad, immutable, a sacred trust between employer and employee that I had somehow violated. He slid the termination paperwork across the desk with the solemnity of a judge passing sentence. The papers rustled against the cheap wood veneer, a sound that would echo in my memory for months. His signature was already there, bold and confident, leaving only a space for mine, an acknowledgement of guilt I would never provide. I studied his face as he waited for my response, the slight upturn at the corners of his mouth that he thought he was hiding. The way his shoulders had relaxed now that the unpleasant business was nearly finished. The satisfaction of a man who believed he'd solved a problem cleanly, efficiently, with minimal mess. The security camera in the corner of his office watched us both with its unblinking electronic eye. The same camera system he'd upgraded 6 months ago, boasting about the new high-definition clarity and expanded storage capacity. The same system that recorded everything, stored everything, remembered everything, including things Marcus apparently believed it had forgotten. I left without signing the papers, without dignifying his performance with a response, without giving him the satisfaction of watching me break. The parking lot stretched before me like an asphalt wasteland, broken only by the scattered islands of streetlights that would flicker on in another hour. My car sat in the employee section, soon to be just another vehicle in a public parking lot. Soon to carry me away from this place for the last time. The drive home gave me 23 minutes to process what had just happened. 23 minutes to let the rage build slowly, methodically, like pressure in a steam engine. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the fury had crystallized into something harder, colder, more useful. Marcus thought he'd ended my story. Closed the book on the troublesome cashier who'd gotten too curious, asked too many questions, threatened his comfortable little kingdom of casual corruption and petty theft. He'd probably sleep well tonight, satisfied with a problem neatly eliminated. But Marcus had made 2 critical errors in his calculation. First, he'd underestimated exactly how much I'd observed during my 8 months at his store. The patterns in the register discrepancies that always coincided with his solo shifts. The way certain deliveries never made it to inventory. The after-hours access codes that somehow enabled private meetings in the storage room. The employee insurance payments that vanished into accounts that didn't seem to exist. Second, and more importantly, he'd forgotten that I'd helped install the new security system. that I'd been the one who'd programmed the backup protocols, set the storage parameters, established the remote access credentials that would allow corporate to monitor their investment. That I still had those credentials. My apartment felt different that night. Smaller, charged with possibility. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the login screen for the store's security system. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting for me to decide who I was going to become. The old me would have filed for unemployment, accepted the injustice, moved on to another minimum wage position where I'd be equally powerless, equally disposable. The old me would have convinced himself that fighting back was pointless, that men like Marcus always won, that the system was designed to protect people like him at the expense of people like me. But the old me had died in that office, smothered by the weight of Marcus's smug certainty and casual cruelty. The person sitting at this table was someone new, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. I entered the access credentials and watched the security interface bloom across my screen like a digital flower opening its petals. 12 camera feeds arranged in a neat grid, each one showing a different angle of Marcus's kingdom. The main sales floor, the storage room, the office, the employee break room, the loading dock, the parking lot. And there, in the bottom right corner, the timestamp showing the last 30 days of recorded footage, archived and waiting. I began with yesterday, scrolling through the hours of footage at high speed until I found the moment that mattered. There was Marcus, alone in the store after closing, moving through the sales floor with the confidence of someone who believed he was unobserved. There he was, opening my register, counting the contents, removing bills with practiced efficiency. The camera captured everything in crystalline detail. The deliberate selection of specific denominations. The careful recount to ensure he'd taken exactly the right amount. The satisfied nod as he pocketed the money and closed the drawer. But that was just yesterday. The system stored 30 days of footage, and Marcus had been playing this game for much longer than that. I settled in for a long night of digital archaeology, excavating the buried evidence of his systematic theft. 3 hours later, I had compiled a catalog of corruption that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. Marcus stealing from registers on 17 different occasions over the past month. Marcus redirecting deliveries to his personal truck. Marcus meeting with suppliers in the parking lot, exchanging envelopes in a dance of bribes and kickbacks that would have seemed comedic if it weren't destroying people's lives. And then I found the crown jewel. 2 weeks ago, Marcus had hosted a meeting in his office with 3 other men I didn't recognize. The conversation lasted 47 minutes, during which Marcus had presented documents, accepted a briefcase, and shaken hands with the kind of formal solemnity that suggested serious business. The briefcase had been full of cash, stacks of bills that Marcus had counted carefully before securing in his office safe, the same safe that was supposed to contain only store receipts and petty cash. I didn't know what deal had been struck, what services Marcus was providing in exchange for that money, but I knew it wasn't legitimate business. The body language told the story, the careful positioning away from the windows, the way Marcus had checked the door twice during the meeting, the nervous energy that had radiated from all 4 men like heat from a furnace. Whatever Marcus was involved in, it went far beyond skimming from registers and overcharging for employee insurance. This was organized, systematic, serious enough to involve briefcases full of cash and handshake agreements that couldn't be documented in any official capacity. I saved everything to multiple drives, uploaded copies to secure cloud storage, and began planning my next move. Marcus had handed me a weapon, but I needed to be strategic about how I used it. One shot was all I would get, and it had to count. The smart play would have been to turn everything over to the police, let the legal system handle Marcus and his criminal enterprise. But the smart play wouldn't give me what I needed. It wouldn't restore my reputation, compensate me for the damage he'd done to my life, or ensure that Marcus paid a price proportional to his crimes. The legal system would be satisfied with justice. I wanted revenge. Marcus had spent years building his little empire of corruption, cultivating relationships, establishing trust, creating the illusion of respectability that allowed him to operate with impunity. He'd made himself indispensable to suppliers, irreplaceable to corporate headquarters, beloved by customers who saw only his public face. But empires built on lies have a fundamental structural weakness. They depend entirely on the maintenance of those lies. Damage the foundation, and everything collapses. I spent the next 3 days conducting reconnaissance, mapping Marcus's world with the thoroughness of a military intelligence officer. His daily routines, his business relationships, his personal vulnerabilities, his pressure points, the architecture of his life, and the load-bearing walls that kept it standing. Marcus lived in Meadowbrook Estates, a gated community where the houses cost more than most people earned in a decade. His wife Sarah managed their social calendar with the efficiency of a military campaign, hosting book clubs and charity fundraisers and homeowners association meetings that kept the family positioned at the center of their community's power structure. Their oldest daughter Emily was a senior at Westfield Prep, captain of the debate team, early admission to Columbia. Their son Michael played varsity baseball and had already received scholarship offers from 3 Division I schools. Their youngest, Katie, was 8 years old and took piano lessons every Tuesday after school. A perfect family, a successful businessman, a pillar of the community, all of it built on a foundation of theft, fraud, and casual cruelty toward the people who worked for him. Marcus's supplier relationships were particularly interesting. The same 3 men from the briefcase meeting had been regular visitors to the store over the past 6 months, always meeting after hours, always conducting business that never appeared in the store's official records. A quick search of the license plates captured by the parking lot cameras revealed names, addresses, business affiliations. All 3 men were connected to Consolidated Distribution Services, a company that had been under federal investigation for tax evasion and money laundering. The investigation had gone quiet 6 months ago, around the same time Marcus had started hosting his private meetings. The pieces were assembling into a picture that was larger and more dangerous than simple employee theft. Marcus wasn't just stealing from his store, he was facilitating something much more serious, providing services that helped dangerous people move money through legitimate businesses, which meant he was vulnerable in ways he probably didn't even realize. I began phase 2 of my operation on a Tuesday morning, choosing the timing carefully. Marcus always spent Tuesday mornings at his oldest daughter's school, attending the parent advisory committee meetings that kept him connected to the community's educational power structure. Sarah always spent Tuesday mornings at her yoga class, followed by coffee with the other wives who formed the social backbone of Meadowbrook Estates. Their routine was predictable, comfortable, secure. They'd followed the same pattern for 3 years, according to the evidence I'd gathered from their social media posts and public appearances. Tuesday mornings were family maintenance time, keeping the various pieces of their perfect life properly aligned and functioning, which made Tuesday mornings perfect for my purposes. I drove to their neighborhood and parked 2 blocks away, walking through the sidewalk-lined streets with the casual confidence of someone who belonged. Meadowbrook Estates was designed to project security and exclusivity, but the reality was more vulnerable than the image. The gates were more decorative than functional, the security cameras more symbolic than comprehensive. The Holloway house sat on a corner lot, a colonial revival with professional landscaping and a circular driveway that suggested success without ostentation. Tasteful, respectable, the home of people who had earned their place in the world through hard work and good decisions. I walked past the house twice, noting the security system panel visible through the front window, the motion sensors that protected the most obvious entry points, the neighbors' houses positioned too far away to provide direct observation. Then I returned to my car and drove to the second location on my list. Consolidated Distribution Services operated out of a warehouse complex on the industrial side of town, the kind of anonymous commercial space that housed dozens of small businesses whose actual purpose was often different from their public description. The parking lot was half empty at 10 in the morning, most of the loading bays standing idle, the whole complex radiating the quiet desperation of businesses barely surviving in an economy that had moved on without them. I parked across the street and used my telephoto lens to document the facility, the vehicles, the people coming and going. The same 3 men from Marcus's meetings were there, along with several others I didn't recognize. All of them moved with the careful alertness of people who had reason to be worried about observation. At 11:30, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the parking lot and parked directly in front of the main entrance. 2 men in expensive suits got out and walked inside with the confidence of people who owned whatever room they entered. They stayed for exactly 17 minutes, then left without speaking to anyone else in the parking lot. Federal agents, almost certainly. The investigation hadn't gone quiet. It had gone underground, moved into surveillance mode while the prosecutors built their case. Marcus and his associates were being watched, documented, prepared for eventual arrest and prosecution. which meant my timeline was more compressed than I'd originally planned. Once the federal case moved into active prosecution, the evidence I'd gathered would become less valuable, my leverage would disappear, and Marcus would face consequences that had nothing to do with me. I needed to move quickly. That afternoon, I created a comprehensive dossier of Marcus's criminal activities, organized chronologically with supporting video evidence and detailed analysis. The register thefts, the supplier meetings, the cash transactions, the insurance fraud, everything I'd discovered presented with the clarity and thoroughness of a professional investigation. Then I created 7 copies of the dossier, each one customized for a specific audience. Copy 1 went to Detective Sarah Chen at the Financial Crimes Division of the City Police Department, along with a cover letter explaining my situation and requesting an investigation into Marcus's activities. Copy 2 went to the District Attorney's Office, marked for the attention of the prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. Copy 3 went to the corporate headquarters of Marcus's store chain, addressed to the Vice President of Loss Prevention, who would be very interested in learning how one of their managers had been systematically stealing from them. Copy 4 went to the Internal Revenue Service, specifically to the Criminal Investigation Division that pursued tax evasion cases. Copy 5 went to the Insurance Commissioner's office, documenting the fraudulent charges that had been applied to employee accounts. Copy 6 went to the local newspaper, where the business reporter had been covering the federal investigation of Consolidated Distribution Services and would undoubtedly find Marcus's connection to that company newsworthy. Copy 7 I kept for myself, as insurance and leverage for what came next. But I didn't send any of them yet. First, Marcus needed to understand what was happening to him and why. I returned to the store that evening, using my old employee access code to enter through the back door. The code should have been deactivated when I was terminated, but Marcus's attention to security details had always been inconsistent. He was more concerned with watching his employees than protecting against external threats. The store felt different in the darkness, larger and more menacing without the softening influence of customers and fluorescent lighting. The aisles stretched into shadows, the security cameras tracked my movement with mechanical precision, and the silence amplified every sound. The hum of refrigeration units, the tick of the wall clock, the almost inaudible whisper of air moving through the ventilation system. I made my way to Marcus's office, where I left a single item on his desk, a printed screenshot from the security footage, showing him counting money from my register with timestamp and camera angle clearly visible. No note, no explanation, just evidence, presented without commentary or demand. Then I left through the same door I'd entered, confident that Marcus would find my gift when he arrived for his opening shift in 6 hours. I was waiting in the parking lot across the street when Marcus discovered what I'd left him. Even from a distance, I could see the moment of recognition, the way his body went rigid as he understood what he was looking at. He moved to the window, scanning the parking lot, the street, the neighboring buildings, looking for some sign of who had invaded his sanctuary. His phone came out immediately. 3 calls in rapid succession, each one brief and urgent, probably to the same associates who'd been meeting with him, warning them that their security had been compromised, that someone was watching, that their comfortable arrangement was under threat. By the time I got home, my phone was ringing. A blocked number, calling with the persistence of someone who wasn't planning to give up easily. I let it ring. The calls continued throughout the day. Blocked numbers, unknown numbers, numbers that traced back to businesses I didn't recognize. Marcus and his associates were trying to reach me, probably to negotiate, threaten, or buy my silence. The fact that they'd managed to get my number so quickly suggested resources and connections I hadn't fully appreciated, which made what I was planning even more satisfying. That evening, I sent the first copy of my dossier to Detective Chen, along with a cover letter explaining my situation and requesting protection as a potential witness in a federal investigation. Not because I was actually afraid, though Marcus's associates were clearly more dangerous than I'd initially realized, but because it established an official record of my allegations and created a paper trail that would protect me if things escalated beyond my ability to control. The next morning, I sent the second copy to the district attorney's office, this time including a detailed timeline of Marcus's meetings with Consolidated Distribution Services and suggesting a connection to the ongoing federal investigation. Marcus called in sick that day. The first sick day he'd taken in the 3 years I'd worked for him, according to Jenny from the deli counter who'd been covering his opening duties. He was probably meeting with lawyers, trying to understand his exposure, calculating his options for damage control. But Marcus's biggest problem wasn't legal exposure, it was credibility. His entire operation depended on the trust of his business partners, the confidence of his suppliers, the respect of his community. Once that foundation started cracking, everything built on top of it would begin to collapse. I sent the third copy to corporate headquarters that afternoon, timing the delivery to arrive during their weekly management review meeting. The loss prevention department would immediately launch an internal investigation, which would lead to Marcus's suspension and eventual termination. More importantly, it would trigger an audit of all his financial transactions, which would reveal the full scope of his theft and fraud. The fourth copy went to the IRS the following day, along with a detailed analysis of the cash payments Marcus had been receiving from Consolidated Distribution Services. Tax evasion was a federal crime with serious penalties, and the Criminal Investigation Division had a reputation for thoroughness that would ensure every aspect of Marcus's finances received proper scrutiny. By Friday, Marcus's world was beginning to unravel in real time. The corporate audit team arrived at the store that morning, 3 serious-looking people in conservative suits who spent the day reviewing records, interviewing employees, and asking detailed questions about Marcus's management practices. Marcus himself was conspicuously absent, officially still suffering from the illness that had kept him away from work all week. The local newspaper ran a story about Consolidated Distribution Services that mentioned several of their business partners, including Marcus's store, as potential subjects of the ongoing federal investigation. The reporter had clearly done his homework, connecting Marcus's private meetings to the larger pattern of money laundering and tax evasion that federal prosecutors were building their case around. The story ran on the front page of the business section, complete with a photograph of Marcus taken at a recent Chamber of Commerce event. In the photo, he was shaking hands with the mayor, both men smiling with the confidence of community leaders whose reputations were beyond reproach. By Saturday, that photograph had become evidence of Marcus's deception rather than proof of his respectability. The insurance commissioner's office launched their investigation on Monday, sending a team to review Marcus's employee insurance practices and audit the accounts where premium payments had been deposited. They discovered that Marcus had been charging employees for coverage they weren't receiving, pocketing the difference through a series of shell accounts that existed solely to facilitate the fraud. The scope of the theft was larger than I'd realized. Marcus had stolen nearly $40,000 from his employees over the past 2 years, money that should have gone toward their health care but had instead been diverted to fund his lifestyle and support his other criminal activities. Tuesday morning brought the news I'd been waiting for. Detective Chen called to inform me that Marcus Holloway had been arrested on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. He was being held pending a bail hearing that afternoon, though his lawyers were expressing confidence that he would be released on his own recognizance. I drove to the courthouse for the bail hearing, curious to see how Marcus would handle his first public appearance since his arrest. The courtroom was half empty, mostly populated by lawyers, reporters, and a few family members who sat in the back rows with the careful neutrality of people trying not to be noticed. Marcus entered the courtroom in handcuffs, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller, diminished, stripped of the authority and confidence that had defined him in his role as store manager. His wife Sarah sat in the front row, her face a mask of controlled desperation as she watched her husband's public humiliation unfold in real time. The prosecutor presented a detailed summary of the charges, emphasizing Marcus's connection to the ongoing federal investigation and arguing that he posed a flight risk given the severity of the allegations. Marcus's lawyer countered with character references, community ties, and employment history, painting his client as a pillar of the community who deserved the benefit of the doubt. The judge listened impassively, reviewing the evidence with the careful attention of someone who'd seen this performance many times before. Successful businessman revealed as criminal. Respected community member exposed as fraud. The same story with different faces, playing out in courtrooms across the country every day. Bail was set at $250,000, a sum that would require Marcus to liquidate significant assets or rely on a bail bondsman who would want collateral worth considerably more than the bond amount. Either way, the financial pressure would force Marcus to begin dismantling the lifestyle he'd built on stolen money. I stayed for the entire hearing, watching Marcus's face as the weight of his situation became clear. This wasn't going to be resolved with lawyers and negotiations. This wasn't a problem that could be managed with the same casual authority he'd used to destroy my life. This was consequences, arriving with the relentless momentum of an avalanche. As Marcus was led back to his holding cell, he turned and scanned the courtroom gallery. For a moment, his eyes met mine across the crowded room. I saw recognition there, understanding, the dawning realization that this destruction hadn't been random or inevitable. I had done this to him, systematically, methodically, using his own actions as weapons against him. He'd handed me the tools of his destruction when he'd decided to frame me for theft, and I'd used them with precision to dismantle everything he'd built. Marcus's expression shifted from recognition to something that might have been respect. The kind of acknowledgement one chess player gives another after being thoroughly outmaneuvered. He'd played a game he thought he understood, but I'd been playing a different game entirely. Then the bailiff turned him toward the door, and Marcus disappeared back into the maze of corridors and holding cells that would be his world for the foreseeable future. The media coverage intensified over the following days as more details of Marcus's criminal activities became public. The stolen employee insurance premiums became a particular focus, generating outrage from labor advocates and community leaders who'd previously counted Marcus among their allies. His wife Sarah released a statement through her lawyer, expressing shock and betrayal at the revelations about her husband's activities. She was filing for divorce and seeking sole custody of their children, who needed protection from the scandal that was consuming their family's reputation and financial security. The house in Meadowbrook Estates went up for sale as Sarah tried to salvage what she could from the wreckage of their former life. The asking price was 30% below market value, reflecting the urgency of a seller who needed to liquidate assets quickly and quietly. Marcus's associates at Consolidated Distribution Services were arrested 2 weeks later, swept up in the federal investigation that had been building evidence for months. The briefcase full of cash that Marcus had accepted had been payment for providing a money laundering service, allowing the distribution company to move illegal proceeds through his store's legitimate business accounts. The federal charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that would ensure Marcus spent significant time in prison, even if he cooperated fully with prosecutors. His store empire, built over 15 years of careful expansion and community engagement, was dissolved within a month as corporate headquarters moved to distance themselves from the scandal. I received a settlement check from the store's corporate office, compensation for wrongful termination and acknowledgement that I'd been the victim of Marcus's fraud rather than its perpetrator. The amount was larger than I'd expected, probably reflecting their lawyer's advice that generosity now might prevent larger legal problems later. But the money wasn't the victory I'd been seeking. The real satisfaction came from watching Marcus's transformation from predator to prey, from powerful manager to powerless defendant, from community leader to cautionary tale. 3 months after his arrest, Marcus appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. He'd aged visibly during his time in custody, the stress and isolation carving lines into his face that made him look older, smaller, diminished in ways that went beyond the orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. His lawyer had negotiated a plea agreement that would result in a 7-year federal sentence in exchange for his cooperation in the broader investigation of Consolidated Distribution Services. Marcus would serve his time in a minimum security facility, but 7 years was long enough to ensure that the world he'd known would be completely transformed by the time he was released. His children would be adults. His wife would have rebuilt her life without him. His community would have moved on, his reputation replaced by the memories of other people, his influence redistributed among leaders who hadn't been exposed as criminals. The judge accepted the plea agreement, but added commentary that revealed his opinion of Marcus's crimes: the breach of trust with employees, the exploitation of vulnerable workers, the corruption of legitimate business relationships, the damage to community institutions that depended on the integrity of their leaders. Marcus stood silently throughout the sentencing, accepting responsibility with the resignation of someone who'd finally run out of options. When given the opportunity to address the court, he declined, probably on the advice of lawyers who knew that anything he said would be used against him in the civil suits that were already being filed by his former employees. As Marcus was led away to begin his federal sentence, I felt the complex satisfaction of a job completed successfully. Not justice in the abstract sense that courts and law enforcement agencies pursued, but personal justice, proportional to the damage he'd inflicted on my life. Marcus had used his position of power to destroy me casually, thoughtlessly, as a convenient solution to a minor problem. He'd stolen my income, damaged my reputation, and left me vulnerable to financial disaster without consideration for the consequences of his actions. Now he understood what it felt like to be powerless, to watch everything important to him disappear without being able to prevent it, to face a future that had been redefined by someone else's decisions about his worth and his fate. The security footage that had initially documented my innocence had become the foundation for Marcus's destruction. The same system he'd installed to monitor his employees had preserved the evidence of his crimes in high-definition clarity, creating an indisputable record of his systematic theft and fraud. The cameras he'd trusted to protect his interests had instead become witnesses against him, silent observers that remembered everything and forgot nothing. The technology he'd used to maintain control over his store had become the instrument of his downfall, capturing his guilt with the same precision he'd once used to document his employees' activities. 6 months later, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through my attorney. It was from Marcus, written from the federal correctional facility where he was serving his sentence. The letter was brief, handwritten on standard prison stationery, and contained no request for forgiveness or attempt at reconciliation. Instead, it was a simple acknowledgement of what had transpired between us. Marcus wrote that he understood the mathematics of what I'd done, the careful calculation that had turned his own weapons against him. He recognized the precision of my revenge, the way I'd used his criminal activities to engineer his complete destruction. The letter concluded with a single sentence that revealed Marcus's final understanding of the game we'd played. He wrote that he'd underestimated me, assuming I was just another disposable employee who would accept injustice quietly and move on with my life. He'd been wrong. I folded the letter carefully and filed it away with the other documents from my campaign against Marcus Holloway. Evidence of a battle fought and won, using nothing more than patience, intelligence, and Marcus's own greed as weapons. The old cash register where I'd worked for 8 months had been replaced with a modern point-of-sale system when the store was sold to new owners. The security cameras had been upgraded again, but the digital archives that had preserved Marcus's crimes were maintained as evidence in the ongoing federal investigation. Sometimes I drive past the store, which now operates under different management with a different name and a different atmosphere. The employees look younger, more optimistic, protected by labor laws and corporate policies that actually mean something under owners who understand that their business depends on treating people fairly. Marcus's former office has been converted into a break room, the space where he'd terminated me now serving as a place for employees to rest, eat lunch, and enjoy a few minutes of peace during their shifts. The security camera that had witnessed my false accusation now watches over people taking breaks they've earned rather than enduring accusations they don't deserve. The transformation feels appropriate. The space that had once hosted corruption and cruelty now provides comfort and safety. The office where Marcus had exercised petty tyranny had become a sanctuary for workers who were valued rather than exploited. I found another job within 2 weeks of receiving my settlement check, this time working for an employer who appreciated competence and integrity rather than fearing them. The experience with Marcus had taught me to recognize the signs of a toxic workplace, to identify managers who saw employees as assets rather than threats, to value transparency over authority. My new supervisor knew about my previous employment situation and had hired me partly because of how I'd handled it. She respected the intelligence and persistence I'd demonstrated in exposing Marcus's crimes, qualities that translated well to the analytical work she needed done. The story of my revenge against Marcus became something of a legend in retail circles, shared in break rooms and employee forums as an example of what was possible when workers refused to accept injustice quietly. I never confirmed or denied the stories, but I didn't discourage them either. Sometimes the possibility of consequences was as powerful as consequences themselves. Marcus's case had broader implications beyond our personal conflict. The federal investigation of Consolidated Distribution Services led to the discovery of a money laundering network that had been operating through dozens of small businesses across 3 states. Marcus's store had been just one node in a larger criminal enterprise that had moved millions of dollars in illegal proceeds through legitimate business channels. The investigation resulted in 47 indictments, including several cases against public officials who'd accepted bribes to facilitate the money laundering operation. The corruption had reached into city government, county administration, and state regulatory agencies, creating a network of complicity that had allowed the criminal enterprise to operate with minimal interference for nearly 5 years. Marcus's cooperation with federal prosecutors had been instrumental in mapping the scope of the conspiracy and identifying the key players who'd made it possible. His detailed knowledge of how the money laundering system worked, combined with the documentary evidence I'd helped uncover, provided prosecutors with the foundation they needed to dismantle the entire network. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's criminal activities had ultimately served the cause of justice, albeit not in the way he'd intended. His greed and corruption had led him to document his own crimes so thoroughly that prosecutors had been able to use his records to pursue much larger targets. 2 years after Marcus's sentencing, the federal investigation concluded with the conviction of all 47 defendants and the seizure of assets worth more than $30 million. The money laundering network was completely dismantled, the corrupt officials were removed from office, and the legitimate businesses that had been exploited were returned to honest operation under new management. Marcus had served as an unwitting catalyst for one of the largest corruption investigations in state history, his personal crimes providing the initial thread that prosecutors had followed to unravel a much larger tapestry of criminal activity. Justice had been served on multiple levels: personal justice for me, criminal justice for Marcus, and systemic justice for the community that had been victimized by the corruption network. The security footage that had started as evidence of my innocence had become the foundation for a reckoning that extended far beyond our individual conflict. On the 3rd anniversary of my termination, I drove past Marcus's former house in Meadowbrook Estates. The new owners had repainted the exterior and redesigned the landscaping, erasing most of the visual reminders of the family that had once lived there. The circular driveway remained, but it now accommodated different cars belonging to different people with different values. Sarah Holloway had remarried and moved across the country, taking the children to a place where the scandal of their father's crimes wouldn't follow them. According to social media posts I'd seen, she'd returned to her maiden name and was working as a paralegal for a law firm that specialized in employee rights cases. The irony of her career choice wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd benefited from her husband's exploitation of workers was now helping other workers fight against similar exploitation. Perhaps she'd learned something from the destruction of her previous life, or perhaps it was just coincidence that she'd found meaning in protecting people from the kind of abuse Marcus had practiced. Emily Holloway had graduated from Columbia and was working for a nonprofit organization that provided legal aid to low-income workers. Michael had lost his baseball scholarships when the family's financial situation collapsed, but he'd earned an academic scholarship to a state university where he was studying labor law. Katie, now 11, was apparently thriving in her new environment, far from the shadow of her father's crimes. The children had survived their father's downfall and seemed to be building lives that reflected different values than the ones they'd learned in Meadowbrook Estates. They'd seen firsthand how corruption and exploitation led to destruction, and they appeared to be choosing a different path. Marcus himself had become something of a cautionary tale in federal prison, his case studied by other inmates who wanted to understand how successful people could make decisions that destroyed everything they'd worked to build. According to a letter my attorney had received from his current lawyer, Marcus spent most of his time in the prison library, reading about business ethics and employee rights. Whether his interest in those subjects reflected genuine remorse or simply an attempt to prepare for his eventual release was impossible to determine. But the fact that he was studying the very principles he'd violated so casually suggested that his time in prison had given him perspective on the damage he'd caused. 4 years after his sentencing, Marcus would be eligible for parole if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and maintained good behavior. By then, the world he'd known would be completely transformed. The retail industry would have evolved, the community he'd once dominated would have moved on, and the employees he'd exploited would have found new opportunities with employers who valued their contributions. If he was released, Marcus would face the challenge of rebuilding his life with the permanent burden of a federal criminal record and the knowledge that his reputation had been destroyed by his own actions. The comfortable authority he'd once enjoyed would be gone forever, replaced by the reality of being a convicted felon seeking employment in a world that had learned not to trust him. The security footage that had documented his crimes would remain in federal archives for decades, preserved as evidence of the price of corruption and the consequences of abusing power. Future prosecutors studying similar cases would review Marcus's story as an example of how systematic documentation could be used to build airtight criminal cases against white-collar criminals. But for me, the footage represented something more personal. It was proof that injustice could be answered with justice, that the powerful could be held accountable for their abuse of the powerless, that intelligence and patience could triumph over authority and corruption. The cameras that Marcus had installed to monitor his employees had become the instruments of his destruction, silent witnesses that remembered everything and ensured that his crimes would never be forgotten. The system he'd trusted to protect his interests had instead preserved the evidence that would define his legacy as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. 5 years after that fluorescent-lit confrontation in Marcus's office, I understood that the real victory hadn't been his imprisonment or the destruction of his criminal enterprise. The real victory had been the transformation of a system that allowed people like Marcus to exploit workers like me with impunity. The investigation his crimes had triggered had led to new regulations, stricter oversight, and enhanced penalties for employers who stole from their workers. The laws that had failed to protect me had been strengthened to protect others who might face similar situations in the future. Marcus's legacy wasn't the comfortable corruption he'd practiced for years, but the systemic changes his downfall had inspired. His crimes had become the catalyst for reforms that would make it harder for future employers to exploit their workers, steal their benefits, or destroy their lives with false accusations. The security footage that had started as evidence of my innocence had become the foundation for a broader reckoning with workplace abuse and exploitation. The cameras that had recorded Marcus's crimes were now part of a federal database that helped prosecutors identify patterns of corruption and build cases against employers who thought they were above the law. In the end, Marcus Holloway had gotten exactly what he deserved. Not just punishment for his specific crimes, but complete destruction of the system that had allowed him to commit those crimes with confidence that he would never face consequences. The man who had casually destroyed my life to protect his own interests had instead destroyed his own life, his family's security, and his criminal associates' freedom. The security footage he'd trusted to protect his secrets had instead preserved them for posterity, ensuring that his crimes would be remembered long after he was forgotten. Justice had been served with the cold precision of digital video, captured in high definition and archived forever. Marcus had been undone by his own technology, destroyed by his own greed, defeated by his own certainty that he was too smart and too powerful to be brought down by a disposable cashier he'd decided to frame. But I hadn't been disposable after all. I'd been patient, intelligent, and determined enough to turn his weapons against him. I'd been everything he wasn't, careful, honest, and committed to actual justice rather than the illusion of respectability. The fluorescent lights in his old office had been replaced with LED fixtures that cast a warmer, more humane light over the space that now served as an employee break room. The security camera still watched from its corner mount, but now it protected workers instead of facilitating their exploitation. Sometimes I wondered if Marcus ever thought about that office during his time in federal prison, whether he remembered the moment when he'd handed me my termination papers with such confidence in his own superiority. Whether he understood that his decision to frame me had been the first domino in a chain reaction that had destroyed everything he'd worked to build. But mostly I didn't think about Marcus at all anymore. He'd become what he'd always been, a cautionary tale about the consequences of abusing power, a reminder that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who bring you down. The security footage that had revealed his crimes was still accessible to federal investigators, archived in databases that would preserve the evidence of his corruption for decades. Future prosecutors would study his case, learning how systematic documentation could be used to build overwhelming cases against white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. And sometimes late at night when I passed by the store where it all began, I could see the red recording light of the security cameras still blinking in the darkness, still watching, still remembering everything that happened under their electronic gaze. Still waiting for the next Marcus Holloway to make the mistake of thinking he was smarter than the system he was trying to game. Still ready to preserve the evidence that would bring him down.